Well, hello and welcome back to Read Becca for my weekly catch up on everything I read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading for roughly the current week, as well as some chatty chit-chat. So, this week's books, let's dive right in. First off, for Horror Mayhem, I finished up The Hollow Places by Kingfisher, and I thought that was the last of Kingfisher's horror works that I had to read, but then I realized the sequel to What Moves the Dead has already come out, so I do have one more. So I will be hopefully getting to that one, because I love Kingfisher's work. And this was no exception. In fact, maybe recency bias, but I think this was my favorite of Kingfisher's horror works. It, for me, was definitely much less gory, so if that sways you, it does have some gore, but it was a little bit more sprinkled throughout than very concentrated, which I can deal with much better, and very low on the body horror, I would say, though definitely some gross stuff for sure, but it was much more atmosphere and spooky stuff, and I get along with that really well. So this is a contemporary story, or contemporary set story, that is inspired by some classic horror. So this was mainly inspired by The Willows by Algernon Blackwood, which I have not read, but now I want to. And it also has some very clear lines to The Magician's Nephew, the first in the Chronicles of Narnia, which is also my favorite of the Narnia books, and is pretty spooky on its own. And they do, in fact, reference the fact that there are some strong connections in the book, which I love that metatextuality. So we are following a woman who, she's getting a divorce and is really struggling with that a bit emotionally. She's really feeling it. And she is mainly worried about the fact that she's going to be moving back in with her parents as an adult, doesn't really want to. And so she takes the opportunity when her uncle, who is a little quirky and odd and runs literally a museum of oddities called the Wonder Museum, she takes the hint or chance when he offers her to come stay with him and help take care of the Wonder Museum while he's going through some health stuff of his own. And so perfect timing, right? And initially we're getting just kind of the mundane details of her feeling this divorce and going through settling in and trying to take up this job, going to get coffee, the normal day-to-day of her life, starting out back at this uncle's that, you know, she has all these fond memories of from her childhood. And then something happens. She discovers a hole in the wall that doesn't seem to quite fit with how the building is laid out. And so that's the inciting incident. So she naturally picks up the gay barista next door at the coffee shop, who's her friend, and they go to explore this hole in the wall. And so that is where I will leave you with them uncovering effectively a portal to someplace strange. And I loved every element of it. As usual, Kingfisher brings the supportive and caring vibes with her characters. She had some really interesting ways of incorporating the museum into this, even though for most of the time, this is not focused on the museum. But I just love that sense of atmosphere that putting this in the Museum of Oddities caused. It was really like the perfect setting to put us in. And just everything about the sense of place made this very gothic feeling, even though it doesn't have any sort of Victorian or Southern Gothic vibe for me whatsoever. It just very much has that eerie dread that you expect looming over you when you read something Gothic. So I really just love this. It, as usual, knocked it out of the park for another Kingfisher horror book. I really need to find another author who is doing the same kind of thing, because this is absolutely my niche. So then let's move on to Miserymay. I read Strike Your Heart by Amélie Nothomb and translated by Alison Anderson from French. So this is a tiny book. It's very character focused and really lovely, rich prose. So I did enjoy this very much. But it was not what I expected at all. It's really immersed in feminine relationships and toxic ones at that, not romantic, but especially ones that involve different power dynamics. So that was very, very interesting. And though this is translated from French, it gave me a lot of vibes of Japanese translated work that I've read. It had that same kind of detached feeling that even though you're getting a lot about the characters. It's in a very minimalist form that to some readers can feel kind of dry. So I think if you know you don't really like Japanese fiction for that reason, because of that tone, you might not like this. But I very much connect with Japanese literature, so it was very much to my liking. And so much of this was unexpected. We go into the story of a woman before she's born. So we're starting with her mother. And her mother is, at the very beginning, depicted in this really cunning, conniving way. She's a young woman who has everything ahead of her, and then as a result of getting into a relationship with a man, falling pregnant, she winds up not having that path, but she can make everyone jealous because the man that she has fallen in with is kind of the guy that everybody wants, and she doesn't really care. She just wants to manipulate him and manipulate the situation to make everyone else jealous. So that is the tone of the relationship, is this woman is clearly kind of awful. She really has this desire to manipulate and doesn't really emotionally engage with anyone. So imagine that as a mother. And that's really what is playing out here. We're getting through the daughter's eyes the experience of having a mother who's extremely cold and withholding, who, as time goes on, she does have other children and uses those children to show a different relationship and make her first daughter very jealous. And so Diane, the daughter that we're following, we see her grow up in those conditions. And it reminded me a lot of I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, except here we're kind of getting that perspective with an adult lens. So I didn't buy it quite as much, whereas in Jeanette McCurdy's memoir, she is trying to give us the child view. So sometimes, like literally, there are times when she's a toddler and she's thinking with an adult brain, basically, about the situation and processing what she's feeling about her mother. So there is a lot of that where it didn't ring true in terms of reality, but as far as the story, it was very compelling to read. So we see her grow up, basically, in that condition, and then deal with that toxic relationship and kind of start to move away from it in university, and then get caught up into another toxic relationship with a professor. And things remain very understated through the entire course of the novel, but there is a really big turning point where things escalate, definitely. And that was, I think, the biggest surprise to me, is there's not a lot to escalate here, but it just really showed how much drama there is in those tensions between these toxic relationships. And so, yeah, it was very, very good, very compelling to read for me, and I just loved the prose and characterizations. This was a great pick for Misery May because everyone was so awful. You just want to go and get everyone therapy. So then I went to a Misery May nonfiction option, which was A Rabbit-Proof Fence by Doris Pilkington. This is a historical nonfiction about the situation when the English came to Australia, and after that they began running something very akin to residential schools, where they were taking Indigenous children and dragging them away from their families and attempting re-education to erase their culture and lifestyle. And so this is the story of the author's family member who went through that experience and not only lived through it, but ran away and followed the rabbit-proof fence across Australia for weeks to go home. And that was such a heartbreaking story. I think for me, this was not a winning read, but it was very well worth having read, especially the first half. So I think the first half was much stronger than the second half. And for me, mainly that was because the first half is giving us a lot of the history. And I loved that it referenced The Fatal Shore, a big chunky book I got last year, which is a history of the beginning days of the colonization of Australia. And so I very much kind of want to read this now. But that early beginning tells us how when the British landed, and they effectively tried to do all of the things that we have seen or heard about happening in the US, where they were attempting to come in where someone else was living and have their own laws and rules and ways of living and impose the British way on everyone. And they just didn't understand that, and that resulted in a huge amount of conflict and a lot of death and a lot of mistreatment of the people whose land they were on. And that was horrific to hear about, though not surprising. And I think that the individual story in the back end made it more personal, because we are hearing about how these children were born out of relationships with the British and mixed race, and then taken with maybe good intent even, because of the lack of understanding. But the amount of harm that was done there was so immense. So you do get to kind of hear that, what the goal was, why they were doing this. You can kind of see it, but it's also still really awful. Once we get into that back half, where we're following the personal journey of these girls as they're fleeing to go home, it does turn into sort of an account of, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then they did this. So it's very straightforward and simple to read, but it's not very engaging. And I've found things like that in books that are intended for teaching history to younger readers, and I don't think this is specifically geared that way, but also I do think this might have been intended to be open to a student audience or accessible to. So that may be why, but it was not very engaging. I also kind of have to question the fact that these were fairly young girls, and we're getting a lot of quotes and anecdotes of things that happened along the way. And for me, I kind of want to know how that was researched or recorded, in what way. Was that just interviews with the people that this happened to and their recollections, and how long did that happen after the fact? But none of that is in here, unfortunately. So regardless, I think this was a great starter that made me want to look into this a lot more. And thankfully, as I said, I do have the Fatal Shore. So I was really happy that this referenced that at the beginning to kind of tell us that's part of where the beginnings of this story can be found. So very good reading. I'm glad I read it, but it wasn't the most engaging book. Then I turned to my mental health May book, The Center Cannot Hold, by Elyn R. Sachs, My Journey Through Madness. So this is nonfiction, obviously about mental health. This is starting from very, very young age, all the way up to, I think, present at the time she was writing this, recounting Sachs' experience as a person suffering from psychosis. And as a very young child, she had a lot of behaviors that stuck out, but weren't quite to the degree of true psychosis. They were things that could be really easily dismissed as just being the behavior of a kid or a teenager, to an extreme degree. But what struck me so much is those early expressions of her mental illness were, so at points early in her childhood, there were signs of things like OCD. And then once she started having these slight breaks with reality, it was very often in a similar way to that, where she had the kind of normal intrusive thoughts people have, but then would fixate on them to a very extreme degree and just start looping on these intrusive thoughts. And so it seems like, or it exposed me to the idea of it just being an extreme extension of things that the rest of us are feeling. And then as she heads into college, because she is a very successful person who strives and is kind of an overachiever. And so we follow her through this litany of really successful college experiences and then extreme breaks with her mental health. Oddly, I hate to make this comparison because it sounds like I'm dismissing or reducing her account here, but the whole time I was reading this, I was thinking of Vita Nostra, a fantasy novel about a magic school, magic university, but it's not your typical magic school. What was so similar between the two is this feeling of being unable to know and things around you just being completely incomprehensible. Through Vita Nostra, these kids are feeling constant dread for appropriate reasons, but everything about the school that they've gone to, the magic school, is so ununderstandable, and they're striving and working so hard to understand, and no matter what they do, they just can't. And so that is how it felt reading this, that it felt like she was going through that. She would try and struggle so hard to get a grip on reality and be unable to. And one of the things that was hard to take reading through this is she struggles all the way up through her life with not wanting to be on medication, needing it, and going through these breaks. And every time she would go on medication, things would start to get better. But she is this type A person who wants to be able to fix the situation. And so she's always working through that mindset of, if I can just do this or change this thing, I will be fixed, instead of recognizing that this is something she's going to have to deal with her entire life and treat forever. She's always looking for the way to fix the situation. And that was so hard. That's so much to say about the way we stigmatize mental health issues, or the way that we have created a perception that is different from treating a lifelong medical issue. Where something like type 1 diabetes, where you do legitimately need insulin all the time, you're not going to be able to completely treat that with diet, but you can make it more manageable. And that's a shift that I think all of us have to make in our thinking about mental health, that yes, some conditions you may be able to get over, but for most mental health conditions, they're things you're going to have to deal with that are not momentary for the rest of your life, and you're going to have to find ways to manage them better. So I think this opened me up to that aspect in a way that I wasn't thinking about before. But yeah, it was such a compelling story of Sack's experience, and one of the things I kept drawing back to was Esme Wei-Jun-Wang's book, Collected Schizophrenias, as well as Susanna Cahalan's Brain on Fire. Both of those books, as well as this book, we have their stories because these women were all really overachievers, and they were not the people that were without resources. They had families that supported them, although Sachs was very resistant to turning to her family or letting anyone support her. In all of these cases, we're able to get this story because they are effectively what we deem high functioning. They are able to have times where they can advocate for themselves. And in the end, Sachs changes careers effectively to become involved in mental health law because she is able to be that person who can hold it together and drive herself, rather than being stuck in a role that are many of her clients where they cannot advocate for themselves. And those people get swept under the rug so often. And so I think it's important to read these stories because they are so rarely told, because the people who are there to tell them can't do it themselves most of the time, I think. And so I just thought this was incredibly, incredibly powerful. And as I said, I basically couldn't put it down. I thought this was so readable, so compelling, and such a page turner. And it really made me want to get to some more of the mental health books that I have had sitting on my docket for a really long time, because this was just a great read that made me think about so much of how we perceive mental health and the stigmas in society that still exist, despite the fact that this was written years and years ago. So, fantastic reading this week, really. That sort of stuff I have ongoing, my current reads, I only have one book, one audiobook, and that is Murder Most Royal, which was on my TBR for the month. Just started it, and I'm very much enjoying it already. So that is all I'm reading currently, and I don't know what I'm looking forward to reading yet. I think I will probably pick up one of my paused books that I have been sitting on because I did not pick any up last week. So I think that's all for book stuff. For watching stuff, I watched the movie Queenpins. It was not a particularly great movie, but it was fairly brainless and very entertaining, and that was about what I needed. Lots of laughs. It stars Kristen Bell and Joel McHale as her jerk husband. But it's about these two women who are couponers, and they find a loophole and start a criminal coupon empire. So it was funny. And that was all I wanted from it at the time. I also, usually I wrap up things when I finish them, but this is contextual information. I've watched about 30 episodes of The Great British Menu. So that's a lot. Yeah, which I am enjoying very much as well. But that is context for the lifey stuff. So the lifey updates are my co-star Gumbo decided to join us today. So where was I? I was going to talk about lifey stuff. or I had just started talking about lifey stuff. So time does not make sense this week. I think I was talking about the show that I watched. I've watched a huge amount of Great British Menu, season 5 specifically. So I will wrap that up probably next week because I'm almost done with it. And I worked 30 hours in 2 days. I read all of this stuff. This is four big books. Not four books is a lot on its own. And I watched a ton. I've not been sleeping much, but it doesn't seem like that much. So time is just weird right now. We did have the holiday weekend in the US, so that maybe accounts for some of it, but yeah, things are ridiculous. I also didn't manage to find a couch that I liked. I tried looking last weekend and that did not work out. And I did clean the basement. So the basement is thankfully open again for the cats, because as I was finishing up cleaning, the tornado sirens went off. And so I had to shuffle all the cats downstairs to the basement. So I was very, very glad to have that done. But yeah, it's just been a lot. I do not know how time is timing right now. And my brain is not working 100% as a result. But hopefully this week we will continue to pack in a whole lot of stuff. I do have a lot of things lined up that I want to read, but as I said earlier, I don't really have anything imminently lined up for what I'm picking up next. So I think I'm gonna get back to some of my paused books and hopefully finish some of those for next week. Editing me here. I forgot to mention my recommendations for the week, even though I had them noted down. My chaotic brain is failing me. So I had 2 videos this week that I really liked and wanted to share with you all that I saw in conversation with each other. The first was from Katie from Books and Things, and the second was from Jennifer of Jennifer Loves Books, and they were both discussing how we perceive when we read. Information processing is such a fascinating topic to me, because I am someone who has information processing disorders, and I don't know if it fits in that category as well, maybe, but I'm certainly down the far end of aphantasia, which Katie discussed in her video. So I really enjoy that discussion, and as someone who has no real visual or auditory experience when reading, I'm blown away that other people experience it very, very differently. So they both did great discussions on that topic. So I will point you to those videos down in the description box below. And I think that's about it from both myself and Gumbo. I hope you're having a wonderful reading week, and thank you so very much for joining me.